Is your risk tolerance statement working for you or against you? That's the topic of today's podcast. Hi, and welcome back. I'm Charlene Deaver Vasquez. If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. I hope you find something useful in the content that I put out. Whatever platform you're on, remember to subscribe, and that way you can get notified when I put out another podcast. I try to do it about every week. So let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. It is your risk tolerance statement. Now, most organizations will have some sort of a risk tolerance statement, and it's usually very general, pretty broad. And this is why I believe most organizations are not leveraging their risk tolerance statement. Not only that, I think that they really don't know how to use it as intended. So let's talk about this for a minute. The risk tolerance statement is the pinnacle of your risk management program. It is the statement that should drive everything else in your risk management program. But that's not actually really what's kind of happening. And here's why. There are a couple of reasons. So to begin with, those of us that are in the industry, we know that this is the beginning of the steps of building out your risk management program. And so you start with kind of what's your risk tolerance statement, or what is your risk appetite, right? And then from there, you start developing policies and procedures, and you build out a framework, and then you have all these things that occur, and you assess the risk, and then at the end of that cycle, you then are monitoring these risks, keeping them in something that's generally called a risk register. So let's just take these two pieces and talk about, just using these two pieces, how most risk statements, risk tolerance or risk appetite, is not working, why it's failing. In the risk register, if you cannot look at the risks that you have and easily determine how well they are meeting that level that you set in your risk appetite statement or your risk tolerance statement, if you can't look at that and clearly say, oh, this is within that tolerance that I said, or it's above it, then your risk management program isn't working, right? It's really just that simple. And here's why I think most organizations struggle with this and fail with this. It's because we are not, in this risk appetite or this risk tolerance statement, we are not using quantitative means to clearly define what that level is. Okay, so even if you're not all the way to saying, I'm ready to quantify this, you still need to be able to say, how do I measure it? Let's just start with that. How do I measure it? How do I know that a risk is more than I'm willing to tolerate? Or is it something that I'm willing to tolerate, right? Let's just start at that basic level. So your appetite or risk statement should be so clear that it defines all the kinds of risks that are outside your level of acceptance. You won't tolerate these. These are not tolerated in the organization. I'll give you an example. If you have an executable vulnerability in your environment that can be easily compromised, that most people would agree that's not tolerated. We don't allow those. Okay, take that and collect that. That's one way that you help frame what this tolerance, risk tolerance or risk appetite statement is. It needs to be so specific that everybody in the organization, upon hearing the statement, knows exactly how to make decisions every day of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Interestingly, we have other policies generally, like computer use policy. Almost every organization has some policy about computer use, what you do and do not allow on your networks, right? Because of the impact it has to the network. You might think about writing your risk tolerance, your risk appetite statement, something along those same lines. At least start by identifying these are the things that we do not tolerate. So we do not tolerate vulnerabilities to exist on our network that are easily compromised, right? So we don't accept that. And then as you move through other things that are unacceptable, when you look at third party, who are you working with? Who are your suppliers? I know that you have some things, situations, conditions that you would think are not tolerable, not acceptable, to have a third party. So if you have a third party, let's say somebody that doesn't have a strong security program in place, they've been hacked 3 times and they show no indication that they're going to really strengthen their product. Most people would say, we're not going to stay with that, right? But those kinds of foundational measures are generally not in the risk tolerance statement. And that's the gap. The risk appetite, the risk tolerance statement should list in some form or describe in some form those kinds of risks that are not acceptable in your environment. Those kinds of risks that for you as an organization would be an automatic no, we just don't do that. Maybe this takes some conversation among the C-suite and among development heads and branch managers and so forth to come to some kind of consensus depending on what your organization does. You may have areas of your organization that are accepting higher levels of risk, so you want a statement that encompasses all of these. Maybe you call out different areas and you are clear that these areas accept higher levels of risk, these do not. But that really is the purpose of what the risk appetite or the risk tolerance statement is about. So step number 1 is take a look at what you might have for your risk tolerance statement or your risk appetite, and go take a look at your risk register. And if you can't clearly identify on that risk register what makes this risk acceptable or not acceptable, then you need to go back and revisit that tolerance statement. And it needs to be so clear that everyone in the organization clearly understands, because you need everyone in the organization to be able to make decisions all the time, every day. Whether it comes to how they handle their emails, are you clicking on every link, or are you only clicking on things that you trust? Whether it comes to decisions about contracts and who they're getting contracts with on third-party suppliers, what products they use in third-party suppliers, what kind of collaborative platforms are people using. You want that statement to be so clear that you can get buy-in from your entire staff, from the entire organization, and you help drive behavioral change so that they clearly understand, just like with that computer use policy. These things are not done here because they're not acceptable here, so I better not do that. But these things are okay, and then that's how you start to really leverage that statement in a way that drives change through your risk management program. Now, let's take it one step further. This is a good start to say you list the things that are clearly not acceptable risks. Now what you want to do is measure your progress over time. And you want to have key progress indicators. You can use that word, KPIs, you can use this, but you want to have a way to measure how much risk it represents. And the reason that you want this is because when we go back to that risk register, the register's purpose is to help management have an overview at all times of where risk levels are compared to that statement. That statement or that appetite is like a line, and you never want the risk to go above that acceptable line, right? And so you should be, if you're managing it well, you should be able to understand what new things are adding new risk, where is it in relationship to this level, when you need to take some action, pull other people in, have a conversation, change your risk levels to keep it under that acceptable level. Now, when you are measuring risk, there are things that you can look at, and every type of risk is going to have different, let's call them indicators, going to have different indicators. And these indicators help you kind of measure how risky this is, right? And so in that risk register, you want to be able to also look at not just individual risks, but in totality. You want to be able to aggregate all these risks together so that not only you know individually, but overall, how is all of your risk going compared to what you said in your statement, where you need to keep that risk level at. And this is why you need to be able to measure. So If you're just getting started, you might use certain measurements that you're tracking over time. If your key focus and risk tolerance is more operational than financial, making sure that you don't have long period outages, right? If that's intolerable, that's definitely going to be something you're going to measure and you're going to track and you're going to keep track of that. On the other hand, if financial impact is important to your organization, then every risk needs to somehow be quantified in financial terms. If that risk occurred, what is the most likely financial impact? Not the worst possible outcome that could happen, and not the least, but what is the most likely that that's going to cost if it happens, and how likely is it that that's going to happen? And that is how you begin to think about risk in a way that you can measure each risk against what you said was acceptable, and how you can aggregate risks to know, well, individually, all these risks look like they're small, but oh my gosh, if one happened, it could cascade to 5 others, and now I have more risk than I expected, and I'm well over my tolerance limit for risk. I hope this is making sense. Setting this up can be seen to be very difficult and cumbersome, but doesn't really have to be that way. It's only what we don't really fully understand that seems kind of scary and, ooh, that's a little too much, so let me not do that, right? And I think this is a big reason why organizations just don't take it to that level. Instead, most organizations have a generic risk appetite statement that it can't be measured, but it looks good on paper. And their risk register becomes nothing more than just a list of risks that they're tracking. That's okay if you are getting started, but as you mature in your practice, you really should have this down to a way that you can measure not only the individual risks and how they match with your risk tolerance statement, but also a way to aggregate these. And that is what we call risk quantification, being able to describe risk in terms of a range. It's not a single value, it's a range because I'm uncertain. So what's the weather going to be today? I don't know. I think it's going to rain. How much? Maybe between 30 and 55, someplace in there. I know it's not the low end and I know it's not the high end. It's someplace in the middle. And that's the way that we speak about risk when we say we quantify risk and we're using probabilistic terms and we're using ways to measure. You know that you're talking about an uncertainty and it's just a question of how uncertain. The more uncertain you are, the broader that range, and the more confident you are, the more narrow that range is. And every risk should then have an estimate of the impact in some type of a range, whether it's operational impact or financial impact, so that you can then compare that range and aggregate that range and compare that to what you said your risk tolerance level was. Now, one last thing that I want to give you before I end on this topic. All of this, everything that we've talked about, in order to be successful, your entire risk management measures and practice all needs to align to the business goals. And that really is a very good way to ensure that as a risk manager, you are not being wasteful and that you get stakeholder buy-in, because everything that you're doing is supporting some other outcome that the business has. And often, when you frame it in that way, you will have certain measures that you know to keep track of, because those are the things that help tell whether the business goal is on track to succeed or if it is on track to miss a target date or fail. Does that make sense? Okay, I know this has been a lot. If you want to learn more, please go hit my website or stay tuned for more podcasts, because this is the kind of content that I talk about all the time. If you like this kind of content, feel free to comment below, let me know, and I'll make more of what you like. Thanks.